So this topic, today's topic, myth history. You know, it's what you make of it, but it can be a very, very interesting thing to think about. But before I plunge in, let me take a minute to introduce the guests today. We have Anjum Hasan. She really needs no introduction per se. She's a very good writer. From that, say that not as a throwaway, but because I have read most of what she has written. Not all of them, but most of them. And her prose is succinct, and it's evocative in terms of how she does it. And her latest book, which is right here, and I advocate that people read it, is an extraordinary piece of literature. And I was very fortunate to have Anjum as a guest on my podcast, The Literary City, a few episodes ago. And we had a wonderful conversation on that. So that's available for you guys to listen to as well. A little bit, I've made some notes about what I should say about Anjum. Let me try and do this. Now, this captivating novel, you know what happened? The reader is transported to Delhi. And you're transported into a heart of Delhi where she has constructed a certain feeling. And rather than the place itself, you really are set in the middle of the feeling about it. And her protagonist is a history teacher through whom Anjum lives her narrative. The rest of it should really be somebody from ICICI is trying to offer me a loan. Nor do I want my car. What am I supposed to do?
Not in my novel as far as I remember.
It is, but I won't tell you this. So, the themes that she deals with, identity, belonging, history, prejudice, she deals with all of these themes and very artfully constructed just in the character of this one guy to whom it's done it. And, you know, as a fellow writer, let me tell you, that's a very difficult thing to do, but she does it with ease and makes it look easy. So that's a wonderful novel. So you're welcome about that. We have Nilanjan Choudhury. He's a former suit. All right. He used to work in corporate India, and despite that, corporate India thrived. All right. His book is another very, very interesting read. I've not had the pleasure of having him on my podcast, but I have read this whole book, and I thought it to be very interesting, and we had a chat about that as well. It's called Song of the Golden Sparrow, right? And this is something else that's done very interestingly. Again, it deals with matters of history, but it deals with the panoply of recent Indian history, right from independence to yesterday. It spans that whole point. And what he does is his narrative is delivered through a yaksha. And as we all know, a yaksha is something, there's a spirit really that was used to encapsulate such stories and take stories across to people. To me, it's very, very interesting that you pick up recent history of India and have a yaksha deliver that sort of message. So as you can imagine, and I'm really speaking for the both of you over here, right? I'm just giving you my own review of the novel, as it were. And it's very important and very difficult to do because you have to set this whole narrative in the voice of the yaksha. When you think about a yaksha delivering the epics, some story from the Ramayana, some story from the Mahabharata, as the case may be, that's easier to understand. It's a little harder to understand how that delivers in a modern kind of a construct. Enough said, again, done very, very wonderfully. And you know, his themes also deal with resilience, really. Am I right? Would I be correct to say that it has? One of the themes is that, but it does have love, it has loss, it has identity, but mainly what comes through this narration of this tale is that tale of resilience. And very often when we have read the epics, or we heard stories of yakshas saying this, that, or the other, they're normally declamations of heroic things that are done. You know, no yaksha ever says, hey, how are you doing? Are you hungry? Do you want lunch? Right? So it's these stories that are set, and that's again a very wonderful thing that has been written. So please give it up for Nilanjan Choudhury. The third part of what I wanted to say by way of introduction is the topic today on which we'll be discussing is myth history. Myth history. Somebody went and made them one word. I'm not sure how they did it. Such a word is called a portmanteau word, right? It's a portmanteau word where you take one word. Sorry?
Maybe even neologism, if
neologism is
We don't do our best to stop it now.
That's okay. With me here is Pranati, known to all my podcast guests as P with an A. She does the etymology section with me over there. So she is a fellow etymologist. So
actually also an academic subject in NCERT books. Soon will be.
Really? We're going to discuss how this is going to become that. So, now, with myth history, I have my view. I'm going to deliver my view, and then I want to step out of the way and then let the authors bring you their views. But I just want to set the perspective because my questions will follow a certain line. Myth history, mysteriously combining myth and history, and or as we call it these days, news. Right? myth history. I don't know. It's going to be my first question that I'm going to pose to them, but I'm going to give you my answer first, simply because I have the microphone. See, basically, myth history. A lot of people think, is this myth? Is this history? And in the context of all the discussions that are happening of late, especially the more contentious ones, it almost seems that myth and history have some kind of an overlap. And is this myth or is it history? And that's the reason they even overlap the word into one. The only common thing is the H, right? So they just made it one H and then they filled it up. But the point is this. To my mind, I don't think that the distance between them is an overlap. I think the distance between them is quite huge. For instance, I sort of asked myself, okay, what am I going to say? What are the different types of the existence of storytelling between history and myth? History, we know, is verifiable fact, as far as one can tell. Myth, you can make up whatever you want, that's myth. That's how it is. What happens in between? Is there an in-between? I have these ideas, and when it comes to Q&A, please feel free to disagree or add to it as the case may be. So we have history, which, as I said, is verifiable. Then you have the empirical evidence, which is you have enough of what has been said or what has been done and anecdotes of things that have worked in the past. So you have all this empirical evidence that's built up and you say, okay, that's good enough for me to make a conclusion that this really happened, as the case may be. Then you have exaggeration. So when you have these Veera colors, for instance, you notice these hero stones on the side of the road, you have great acts, guys with 10 heads and so on, you're supposed to understand that the sculptor didn't really intend to try to convince you that somebody had 10 heads. He just wanted to depict some tale of heroism or different aspects of it, so that's how he depicts it. But then let's just put it down and say that's exaggeration. It's not necessarily untrue, it's not necessarily made up, but it is exaggerated, tales of valor and so on. Then you have historical fiction, where someone takes an aspect of history and then writes fiction around it. It's based on an aspect of truth on which you spin stuff, you color between the lines, you do whatever you need to do. Because, when you write a history book, you can't tell every conversation verbatim, so you try to fill it in. It's call it, historical fiction. And then we have the whole of what the culture of the universe has done, which is symbolism. And then symbolism is set in terms of things like what you might find if you broke open a stupa and then took everything from inside, you'd find symbols. And symbolism, like wheels and objects, that all of which have a certain story and they have a certain real history, verifiable history attached to them. They also have myth attached to them. So that's one stage before. And finally, you have myth. Myth is myth, as the case may be, right? So that's what I feel. Now I want to start. That's enough said. You've heard enough from me. So I'm going to get myself out of the way, except to ask questions. First to you, Anjum. So what's the distance between, history based on fact and myth? What's the distance? Is it like a line between the two, or is there a chasm?
Thank you so much, Ramji. First, for reading my novel so sympathetically and warmly, that was wonderful. And like you said, we had a very interesting chat about it, and also connecting to some of my earlier work,
Yes, we did.
which is up on Ramji's very interesting literary podcast, Literary City. But we are not going to cover the same ground, I think, because we are already far afield now with myth and history,
There you go.
which is like half the world, practically. So in order to, I think, not be skidding all over the place and keep it anchored, I'm going to try and see how I can relate these two concepts to my novel. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, I would be in danger of being mistaken for like somebody on the NCERT committee or maybe a historian,
Let's talk about that later.
which I'm not. I'm not a historian, I'm not a mythologist, I'm not setting a syllabus for school children or for anyone here. What I'm trying to do is imagine, right? That's what a novelist does. And in the novel is a character who I think will err, if he has to err, will err on the side of history, and in the sense that you meant it, on the side of facts. So my guy, Alif Mohammad, is a very innocuous character. He, again, is not aiming to make any large gestures in the field of either myth or history, but the fact is that he is a teacher of history to young children in a school which happens to be in Old Delhi, and he happens to be a Muslim, teaching history at a time when both the teaching of history is fraught and being a Muslim is fraught. So he ticks certain boxes. I was setting it up in a particular way, obviously, but then I didn't want to go down the obvious paths, because why should I write a novel then, if I'm only going to tell you what you already know so well, right? So I think that's where what I said at the beginning, the word I used, imagination. Okay, so I take somebody who's very familiar, I put him in a obviously inflamed, potentially explosive situation. He's teaching history. He's bringing in things into the classroom that the authorities don't like. He's taking his children to see historical Mughal architecture. He wants them to ask questions. He wants them to challenge the received view of history. So already there is potential trouble, right? So this is the view of history that he's channeling, which is a very, till recently was very business as usual, right? History is what we read in the textbook. And the curious thing, I think, despite the fact that, like you say, it's become so contentious and so difficult to talk about these things without explaining what you mean, the fact is that there was never a better time for history writing in India. We have so much interesting popular history, well-researched popular history coming out. So much academic history is being done that is phenomenal on India, by Indians, by other people. It's, in a way, it's like a golden time for history writing. And there's more research, there's more scientific evidence to prop up things that wasn't there before. There's more DNA testing, to use just one example. So Alif is somebody he's never going to make a contribution to that, because he's a nobody in a novel, but he's excited by it, right? So that's an imaginative, alive, curious view of history from an enthusiast. But there's also myth. Of course there's also myth, because we all live with myths. Myths are not just, I don't think they're just exaggerations or things that you have to measure by the yardstick of history. I think myths are what human beings have needed and used from the beginning of time. And the one myth that I examine very closely in the novel, and I'll hand it over to Nilanjan after that because I think he's examining the same myth, is the myth of the nation, right? What is this country called India that we all live in, and can we agree on what kind of place it is and who it belongs to, right? That is the myth that I am trying to take apart in the novel. And he agrees with some of the other characters. He doesn't agree with some of the other characters because they all have their own ideas of what India is. So the myth of India, which doesn't mean that, you know, it's a fiction. We know it to be true because we all live in it and we all talk about it. But the Nehruvian idea of India is, I think, very fascinating still to me, even though to some it's an anachronism and it's something that it's time to let go of in some ways. I think it's still very alive. It's behind a certain, you know, the well-worn ideas, the secular, the liberal, the constitutional idea of India. It's all informed by the Nehruvian myth of India, which does not mean that it is a fiction. It's just a particular way of imagining the country. And so what my character does is think a lot and read Nehru and debate in as lively a way as possible, because this is a novel, this idea, this myth of India. And I think, I mean, novels can be so many things, right? Like you said, I mean, historical fiction, we are also in an era where To imagine means to imagine the fantastic. You know, I taught a workshop, one class at a workshop a couple of years ago with a friend who's himself a writer, and he does this sort of long getaway kind of over a few weekends workshop. And he was telling me about this young writer at the workshop who was introduced, I think, to Jane Austen or Charlotte Bronte or one of like the very realist 19th century writers. And she said, this is not fiction. Fiction is like making things up that don't belong to the real world. So we're also in an era where fiction is seen as something fantastic. A lot of young people do, and I know this because I've also run creative writing workshops and met younger people, or not younger people, but people who want to write fiction, and this idea that how can everyday life be fiction? It's too tawdry, it's too dreary to be the subject of fiction. And to me, that I take the opposite view. To me, nothing is too pedestrian to be the subject of fiction if you can bring imagination to it. So that's basically my novel, everyday life channeled through fiction, exploring both history and myth in this way. I hope this was not too long.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I mean, John le Carré made a whole career of making a spy a very ordinary person.
Yeah.
And all these things that we young guys had about becoming James Bond all laid to waste because it's, his characters are very ordinary people. They do very ordinary things.
Yeah.
I'm going to turn to you, Nilanjan. I want to take it off from where she said, now, you're also a man of science. Now, Nilanjan runs a place called Curiosity, which is a science center for children, in essence. But really, people should go and take a look at it. It's a wonderful project. It's a wonderful place set in a large area, which brings me to my question. We talk about history, we talk about fiction, we talk about myth, the fantastic. And we're going to pedal back to something I have to ask you based on what you said. But first, history is fact. Now, I do understand that very often you say, oh, you can't judge history by science, or you cannot judge science by anything because science is what you've discovered till now. What about all the stuff that you haven't discovered? And it's very easy to take an argument out of what you know and set it in some loosey-goosey place so anyone can have anything to say about it. Would that be a fair summary? As a man of science, as a man of history, how much respect do you give for pure, simple, unadulterated fact?
You've introduced me very kindly. By the way, again, thank you for reading the book and hosting this session after reading the book. It might not have been the case. I'd also like to thank all of the people who are here today on a wet Wednesday evening after a long work day for joining us on such esoteric topics, and Ravi and everybody else at BIC for doing this. So you've I don't know if I call myself as a man of science or a scientist or a historian, certainly not a historian. I've studied science and I have loved it, and I've loved some of the way that science is done, especially physics and maths, and the process of determining what is true and what is not true, and also recognizing science is very importantly about recognizing your boundaries. You are only provisionally true. So you are only provisionally true until nature proves you false, and nature, being infinitely more wiser than you, constantly proves that you are wrong. From Copernicus to Galileo to Newton to Einstein to quantum mechanics, we have been proven wrong at every stage. So one of the things that I think, without necessarily being a scientist who can do really great science, is just to imbibe that principle that the basic thing that science teaches you is skepticism. And I think that healthy amount of skepticism should apply to anybody who reads newspapers, who reads history books, who reads anything really of that sort, to pass it through the filters of your own, could this be true? Could this actually have happened? If this happened, then this should have happened, to evaluate consequences of certain actions and so on and so forth, right? So that whole element of being skeptical, the whole element of being humble enough that I don't know anything. In fact, I know very little. I mean, if you take many scientists, although, we the last, for example, accepted experimentally proven, understanding of the universe is the Standard Model, which came out in 1979. And since then, it's all wobbling around in the dark, right? In the same way, I think when it comes to human history, we need to be, even as historians, I think, be humble enough to acknowledge that we don't really know it all. So no matter if it's not R.C. Majumdar's history which is necessarily gospel truth, or was this person named Sitaram Goyal, I think, his history being the gospel truth, and neither may Irfan Habib's or Bipin Chandra's histories be the gospel truth. I had, when I was in a place called the Azim Premji Foundation, briefly, it was a foundation engaged in education and so on and so forth. I was put into a sort of manthan session, shivir as they call it, on history, and it went on for 2 or 3 days. And there were all these really great historians there, and I, in my callow self at those days, so they went on talking about there is no such thing as, there may be no such thing as fact in history. There is no fact without perspective. It's all perspectives. Ashoka was a great king or not a great king. I mean, it depends on various types of perspectives that you bring into the whole picture. And at which point of time, I used to get a little flustered with this whole thing. But there are things you can prove. At least you accept that this is true until this point of time. As I've grown older, I think I've started feeling these boundaries, like you say, between reality and what is real, what is imagined, what is invented for vested interests, what is invented innocently, shifting a fair bit. And that's one of the reasons that I've written this book in that style. It's written in the style of an unreliable narrator. Mm-hmm. He talks about all sorts of things. He completely throws in a fact that is completely true and one that is completely false. He imagines situations that happen. So like hers is a teacher of history, mine is a student of history. He's seeing it unfold in front of him. He lacks the perspective to see it, 50 years later when true historical events will emerge as the, maybe in a more saner sense. And that's why it comes up right up to today. Right. So it almost borders on news. And that's the reason that I've made my narrator somebody who is a very smart-ass, wisecracking, yaksha type of thing, who doesn't take the stuff very seriously, because it's difficult to know when to take it seriously, how to take it seriously, etc., etc. A long, rambling answer, but I hope I touched upon something that you asked.
You certainly have. And that wasn't rambling at all. That was pretty much on point. But I have to ask a question. I'm going to persist with you.
Sure.
I'm going to take you guys through 2 different topics, using fiction and misusing fiction. Now, I'm using fiction basically as a guardrail, okay? Because at the end of it, when we talk about science, we talk about history, there are certain things that we must accept as incontrovertible. Simplest example being 2 + 2. It can't be anything else. And no amount of pussyfooting is going to change the outcome of that particular question. And then when you take it beyond a point, to my mind, the conversations that I've had with people with whom I can have these kinds of conversations, like today, often result in people saying, it's most of what goes into the realm of fiction or realm of argument is where people don't have a complete understanding or just not willing to look at it. And I want to use some examples from history and how history, and talking through history and historical narratives and fiction. I don't want to set it in India because then it'll be question mark as to whether Mahabharata war really happened or didn't happen, and then people have evidence for it. But I'd like to take it away. Let's go to medieval England, for instance. And there are 2 people that I want, 2 historical characters, historical within inverted quotes, with quotation marks. King Arthur and Robin Hood. Now, there were a lot of people who believed that King Arthur was a real king. Now, they may have a little doubt as to be skeptical about whether he actually pulled a sword out of a stone, but they believe that King Arthur existed. Now, there is no evidence that he existed at all. And historians, British historians, have no trouble saying that he is a mythical character. But somewhere along the line in the narratives and the stories of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, they brought in things like the Saxon War. And then they have a lot of episodes of the Saxon War where they retold that story using all the characters from King Arthur. Right? And then now it becomes a little bit of a problem to understand. Did it happen? Did it not happen? There are people who still really believe. It gets worse with Robin Hood. Why worse? First of all, King Arthur's, all these stories were set in the 5th and the 6th century. Robin Hood, if I'm not wrong, 12th century or thereabouts. And all of the stories about Robin Hood have less evidence than that of King Arthur, have less in terms of historical characters. But there are people, historians, who say maybe it actually happened. And they've come to some nervous understanding that Robin Hood represents many bandits around the area. They've conflated all of that into one Robin Hood. And in order to make it interesting, he gives all the money to the poor. And however the narrative goes. But to me, it's a little irksome that there are some people, historians, by historians I mean people who have studied it, have a training, and have the benchmarks and yardsticks by which they do what they do, saying that maybe Robin Hood existed. So the question I have to ask you is, once again, back to your Yaksha. The character interested me a great deal, and you've answered part of the question. You know, a Yaksha is generally a person of irreverence. You know how we deal with our mythology with a great deal of reverence. Most the average person deals with it with reverence. But many of the stories that are told by people have a healthy degree of question and irreverence about them in the Yaksha. My question was going to ask you is, you appear to have adapted that into your narratives of history. Now, nothing of the history of India that you have represented from 47 to last year, 2022, right? None of that, to me, is infactual. You have a pretty good factual understanding. But you've managed to put this layer of this Yaksha over there telling the stories. And a Yaksha can take it anywhere he wants to go, right? So the question that I have is, how did you get this interesting core idea? Why did you get the Yaksha in place? Because you had a choice. You could have written a history book. Did you bring the Yaksha in just to sell copies? What did you do?
No, I'll tell you why. When I was in school, I hated history. I detested it. History, geography, and civics, the day ICSE exams got over, no one was happier than me. Because it was stultifyingly boring, you know. You did ICSE, I don't remember if... I just hated having to know how many columns there were in the Somnath temple and the architectural styles of, you know, the Corinthian pillars used. I just hated it. I just hated it. No, that was the textbook.
Nobody ever taught me all this.
It was all in the textbook. It was a syllabus. It was a standard textbook, right? So, whereas I used to love my Amar Chitra Katha. Right? I used to love that. And the difference is, of course, a dry statement of fact versus storytelling. And storytelling in which a whole lot of imagination is splashed into the skeleton of the facts, right? And in a way, this book, before I come to the Yaksha, if I have a minute or two, this whole book, while we've said history so many times, at least the way I see it, that this book is about the future. And it began during the pandemic in the lockdown. I started writing it in 2022, where I was stuck inside this house and I didn't have to go out to work and so on. And there was finally some time and space in my head, which is like very rare. And I just started thinking about how we landed up where we did land. You know, at that point of time, there was nature in a way getting back at us, right? That's how the pandemic began, you know, because and then during that time I was also involved in a very minor way in providing food packets to migrant laborers. And I used to go around Bangalore.
Wait a minute, but there is that in economics, right? Malthusian theories are exactly
which
that.
is?
Malthus theories is that as population grows, nature will take care of cutting the population.
I thought Malthusian theory was more that we'll run out of food because food production wouldn't keep up. Not so much pandemics.
pandemic, big part of what Malthus said.
Is it? Okay. I missed that part maybe, but I thought it was more that we would run out of food production. But pandemics are more and more likely, as Yuval Harari says this, that, as populations become denser, as more they stick together, and your boundaries between your animal habitats and human beings recede, right? They shrink. So, and that was happening, and then because of this relief program, I used to see these migrant laborers. It's unimaginable the way they stayed in these houses in Bangalore. I mean, it was just unimaginable. And you mentioned the word resilience, and it was just that I could see these people from Bihar, Bengal, Assam, etc. They go anywhere for survival, and they do anything for survival, and they survive. And so this whole idea of a person who comes from nowhere, and that's the protagonist, not the Yaksha as the narrator, but the protagonist is an orphaned boy from the forests of Bethla who comes from nowhere, is likely to stay there, but luckily gets picked up by a prince who's lost his kingdom. When the takeover of the princely states happened, and he's whisked off to Calcutta because he has a certain gift of talking to animals, and that guy misuses him to make money on the racing tracks, etc., and then he rises, okay, and he becomes finally a real estate developer in Bangalore. That's the narrative arc. But that arc, having started from 1947, where the book starts, till even modern times, is full of blood, so that, of partition, of the Naxal movement, of the Sikh riots, of Godhra, where Godhra plays a very important role in all of this. So it's full of these bloodied events, and yet there are very many beautiful things also that are part of this 75 years of history of India. The fact that we're still together is a miracle, right? It's when Churchill said that I see this nation, is going to collapse and just disappear, and everybody has written of India, and yet here we are, like those migrant laborers are, surviving. But the choice of the Yaksha one was, if I am to write about these very serious things, there is a certain type of writing which I love. I mean, you call it satire or whatever it is. I've taken inspiration, especially from films like Dr. Strangelove, okay, or Jaane Bhi Do Yaro. I mean, those two films have played a way where you're able to talk of serious things but not seriously. And for that, I needed a narrator who's not invested so much. He needs to be from outside. And what better from outside than a spiritual being itself, right? Who's exiled to this place. And he just sees it in a certain dispassionate way. He does become passionate about the people that he's narrating the story of after some time. But that was one. The second was this whole business of, it's quite obvious that the history that I'm talking about, while it has certain facts, there are plenty of non-facts mixed into it. This whole thing that it is contemporary history being told by an unreliable narrator who has no problems in inserting myths into it. As a famous person once said, that it is quite likely that rhinoplasty was invented in India, right? And we believe it, right? So I wanted to take pot shots at that, number one. I also wanted to create a image which would be, here we stand in 2022, here's where we are. We're still desperately poor. We need to become richer. That's going to come at the cost of severe environmental damage. And we also saw in the pandemic, this whole thing of Muslims not taking their vaccinations. There was a whole divisive force that raged through the country at that time. So the three themes that I think will make or break India, whether we will become a more developed country, but whether we will do it preserving, nature in a certain way, and whether we will preserve the sort of social harmony that exists today. So it was the past and the future in a way combined through this voice of this Yaksha who's telling you, take it easy in a way. These things will pass. Yeah, sorry. Long answer, sorry.
No, it's fine. Please, as much as you want. But it's succinct enough for me to understand from here that it's a choice that you made. You answered the question about the choice of bringing the Yaksha and having the Yaksha tell things that you might not want to address in your own voice.
Yes.
or chose not to, as the case may be, which is what I'm going to bounce back at you now, Anjum. Now, your history professor is this very lovable, endearing guy, and you immediately see him as an underdog. You immediately see him as this guy that's for no fault of his has to face all this prejudice that's going on. Now, I have to ask you a quick yes/no question so that it sets the stage for the next part. You've written this book. You've been interviewed by many people, including me, in the past, and I haven't really. I don't really read too many other interviews per se, but I do have this question. Are a lot of people addressing your book as though you've written a book on politics?
Yes and no.
Okay.
The best reviews to me, and obviously I'm prejudiced about my own book,
Right.
are those who have fallen in love with Alif.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you are inside Alif's head and around his social circle for the whole book is basically divided between those two things, right? Either you're thinking with him or you're in the world with him. So
Right.
unless you actually like the character for his own sake, I don't know if you're going to go with this book. So I think roughly half the response has been, politics. We need this kind of book about what is happening to Muslim lives. Well-meaning, but to me, that response falls short of what I was trying to do because, of course, it's there. Of course, there are a variety of Muslim lives depicted in the novel. There are also lives of people who happen not to be Muslim. So it's not exclusively within quotes Muslim novel. But yes, of course, politics comes in. I can't escape that.
But what was your driving intention behind how you constructed the novel? Because we are talking about, the narrative of history, and you are talking about recent events. At some point in time, this will become a reference book for history, some years down the line. Right now, when you wrote this novel, you could have written that story in one of many ways, right? Importantly, you could have picked a completely different subject to write about, but in today's political environment, you wrote about the prejudice. And whether books should be written, shouldn't be written, my personal politics is that I'm very happy you did. But set that aside for a second. Did you use Alif, the history teacher, did you use this teacher as a vehicle for your personal narrative on prejudice on the subject?
Absolutely not. If you're asking me a question about whether I am Alif, I am not. I haven't gone through those experiences. I don't teach history in a school in Delhi. I don't even live in Delhi. I've never lived there. So I was trying to create somebody who is very different from me in many respects, in most respects, right? I was trying to fictionalize as much as possible, and those are not my experiences. I have not led a life of the kind that Alif lives and had those kind of experiences and prejudices to deal with. But I want to go back again. I think I want to rewind to what I started with, which is imagination. Mm-hmm. What do we do when we write novels? And I think the job of the novelist is not only, of course, you need to make things up. You need to create a vehicle for what you want to say, and that vehicle has to be as alive as possible, right? And so a character who seems as real as possible, who has experiences that are recognizable to readers, it's very important. But that's just the vehicle. What am I trying to do here? And I think it goes back to something that's way deeper. It's not about trying to decide whether the Mahabharata was actually fought in real life or not. We are not, as novelists, trying to settle historical arguments or history versus myth. That's not our job. I think our job is to ask, what is this society like? What does it look like? And what is going on in the heads of people who would even ask that kind of question? What are their values? So to me, as a novelist, I'm asking, what are the values of India in 2020, whenever the novel ends actually in 2019, so very recently, not as recent as Nilanjan's, and I took a long time to write it. I've been writing it since 2017. What is a portrait of this society in terms of its values that I can write as a sympathetic novel? That's my job, I think, as a novelist, and that's what the realist novel does. I mean, even the magical realist novel could do that, but I think the realist novel has a history of having done that. And there is no answer to that question, right? Because you're trying to present it as ambivalently, confusingly, open-endedly as possible. But I think if you succeed in showing a certain snapshot of the values that people live by, and they don't all live by the same values, even if they might all happen to be Muslim. Alif is often arguing with his wife, he's arguing with his son. So it's not that I'm pitting one religion against the other. It's about people saying, this is what I believe in because it suits me, or because this is what I need to get ahead in life, or this is what we were taught in school. So yeah, to me, it just goes back to that. What kind of people are we, and what do we believe in, and why? I think if one succeeds in doing that as a novelist, it's enough. I don't know if one can do more. You wanted to ask about the fantasy thing.
Yes, absolutely. So the question is this: you've answered part of the question in what you're looking at. The importance as to whether you were using Alif to make a political statement is the core of that question. Is not quite that core of the question. It's up to interpretation as to whichever way they want to do it. But clearly, you weren't doing it. That wasn't done. You were telling a story. You were writing a book of fiction.
Well, it depends on what you define by politics. I think to write a Muslim character who's a teacher of history is already to be political in some ways, right?
Mm-hmm. That's what
you
I
are
mean.
making a
Yeah.
choice to do that.
Right. No, I understand. That's not what you're doing over there. But in the context of using a history teacher, as opposed to a teacher of whatever other subject, geometry, for instance. So using a history teacher in order to set this novel over there creates a certain empathy for the subject at hand, right? Because it's woven in. Now, in the hands of a novelist who has craft, such as yourself, it works. It can happen. Which brings me to the next part of what I want to say. The role of novelists is very clear. You write novels. These novels are works of art. They're supposed to be read as literature. They're not supposed to be conflated with what should be known as fact or incontrovertible in terms of science. Which brings me to this business of misusing fiction, and the reason I set this up, this segue that I asked you, was to bring it down to how history, or the absence of it, is used in political expediency as well, in terms of how the different people come into it. I had a very interesting guest on my show, Professor Ganesh Devi, who wrote this book about the Indians, and he was a guest on my podcast. We did a live session at Blossom Book House as well, and I completely enjoyed talking to him. He has done sessions over here at the BIC. And asked him what drove him to write his earlier project, his huge, big project about the languages of India, which is a massive 26-volume set. Because his entire driving force was because the government constituted some kind of a committee that was going to rewrite everything, and many languages were conflated into other, and they were going to lose a lot just in favor of keeping a few languages in place, driving with one reason and one reason alone, political expediency. And they say history is written by the victors, so who knows how much of history is lost to history, as the case is. In this case, everything that everybody does is adding to history. Even when you write a novel these days, the first thing people look for was the kind of question that I asked you, which is not really my question. It was representative of the number of questions that I presume are asked of people like yourselves, which is, were you writing a political book immediately? Yeah. Not leaving you alone to be a novelist, right? So it brings me to this part of the question. Now, in terms of misusing history, let me ask you, Nilanjan, let me first put this across to you. Let's talk about history textbooks. What should we be teaching our kids? Should history textbooks contain strictly verifiable accounts of history, as far as possible, incontrovertible? Or shall we just play fast and loose and let the kids learn whatever it is they want to learn, even if it is not verifiable?
I mean,
I unfortunately, other people aren't. So it has to be brought into subject.
I really don't know. I mean, I'm not a curriculum setter or so on. So I guess I really don't know. But I think, I'll give an example. Something that I didn't know that, that history could be taught in this way. So when my daughter went to university, which happens to be Azim Premji University, they had a course on Indian history. And I found it very interesting in the way that they taught the course. So it was like almost like inside out. So they were asked first to find out about the history of the campus. I mean, the land that they were, the land that on which the campus was built. So they were asked to find out who did this land belong to? What used to happen before? Who are the people who stayed here? Was it, buffaloes grazing here? What happened to those people? Where did they go, right? So it started at that level. Then the level 2 was your locality, beyond that, Sarjapur. So they got a glimpse of the IT industry and how that evolved and why did it evolve, right? So it was almost like a research-based project starting from where you are, and then it went on a little bit to Karnataka and then to the national level. So it was not so much as teaching controvertible versus incontrovertible fact of myth versus history. It was essentially trying to teach them how to think about things that have happened, how to think about things that you've been told, that are there in textbooks. Do they make sense to you, etc., etc. So now I know that that's a process that cannot necessarily be applied at mass scale to the 200 million kids who study in Indian schools, right? That's 200 million. You can do it in a small elite university like APU, but you can't do it everywhere. So I'm really not sure how history should be taught. I think the crucial thing, whether it is history or any other subject, is how to think, how to use logic, how to apply your own mind, how to be skeptical and stuff like that. And then there will always be political regimes, this side or the other. One side will come, the other side will come. History is a contested field. I think it will continue to remain contested for a long time. There are going to be degrees of crap entering or exiting out of that system. So students, I think, need to have certain forms of armor and protection, especially if they're interested in this, and read beyond their prescribed textbooks, which quite often will appeal to the lowest common denominator. What the lowest common denominator, i.e. the NCERT textbook, should contain, I don't know, but I suppose you need to have the right people and you need to have the right diverse set of people there, right? People who say that, well, R.C. Majumdar may have said a few right things in his time and Irfan Habib may also have said a few right things in his time. And why don't the proponents of both camps argue and then bring out, what should be, what is taught to schools, right? So let debate create content rather than some one-sided, lopsided view.
I get it.
And I guess fiction can contribute to that way of seeing the world.
So here's my question.
I think Subhadra Sengupta's books and others, sorry, just for that, I mean, the storytelling form of teaching history, I think, is a fantastic way. It embeds much deeper, much sharper, and I'm content over form in the sense. I think the form is as important as the content.
Yeah, my recent guest, William Drimple did that very well. He talks history very well. The amount of research that he does, that he goes into it, and everything that he writes in the book has always got something to reference. Yes. But to hold your feet to the, I like, you've answered the question in one phrase that I pull out of everything that you said, because a good journalist will always do that. All right, and that is all kinds of crap come into it. All right, so that's fine by me. But moving on from there, this is not to become.
And I think.
Oh, that's okay. This discussion is purely academic, nothing to do with politics. It's not. I'm not bringing politics into it. I intend for this to be discussed only in terms of choices that we need to make. Anjum, history textbooks, back to the business of history textbooks. Historical fiction, all of these things can be brought into it. Interesting ways to tell a story rather than the dry and boring nonsense that we were taught to mug up all the dates and so on, as you can answer them. All of us did that. We had to go through this. Very, very, very boring. Cycle it down to something like an 8th standard textbook. One of the things that I had in mind was, the discovery of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, for example, which is like the cornerstone of a lot of history that is taught to us since. That discovery happened in the 19th century, fairly recently. So my big question that I've been asking historians and haven't got a single answer, and later on if there's anyone among you who can answer it, great, What did they teach in school before then? Before they discovered Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, what did they talk about? Where are all the controversies? Now we're rife with views on the Aryans. Did they, didn't they? Where's the wheel? Without the wheel, there was no chariot, so they couldn't have come in a chariot. And take the argument, and a lot of straw man's arguments and so on. The question I still have is, at that point in time, whatever history was available to people was taught in schools. And you talked about your daughter being in university and being able to talk about the campus and the history of the campus. They've reached a certain level of maturity in their minds. But the place where you shape minds is not that late in life. The fertile fields are the minds of those, let's say, I'm just calling it 8th standard textbook, to pick a number, pick any other number you like, something like that. So at that point in time, you're a novelist. You're very clear that you're not a historian. Both of you have taken pains to say, I'm not a historian, I'm not this, I'm not that. But you are a novelist. How can a novelist be asked to write a history textbook for 8th standard?
Why should a novelist be asked to write a history book?
Exactly, that's my question.
And so that's the first question, which is a question to your question. Why should a novelist be asked to do that? And secondly, I think I agree with Nilanjan. There's so many much more livelier ways of teaching history, of which narrative, using narrative to enliven history could be one, and has been done. And again, I think we are in a good time, because there's so many Indian writers writing history for children in a way that is much more interesting. I don't know how much of that is coming into the classroom, but it's there, right? But I don't want to limit fiction to just narrative frames. Fiction, a novel is not just storytelling.
Right.
It's much more than that. To me, fiction is a field of knowledge all on its own, right? And it is, look at the history of the novel. Look at the history of the modern novel, from Don Quixote, 400 years of incredibly powerful novels that have changed the way we think about the world. And there are some historians of the novel who would say that's an alternative history of the world through the novel. Kundera does that, and that view of the novel for me is a touchstone, because he says the whole European tradition of like Cartesian rationality, man as the master of nature, the distinction between the body and the mind, the Enlightenment, the tradition that we know so well that is the basis of Western rationality. An alternative tradition to that is Don Quixote. He's the pioneer of an entirely different tradition of thinking about the world. And that tradition is not so sure about who's the master of nature and who's the lord of the universe. And the term he uses, which other writers use, and I think instinctively every novelist feels that, is the wisdom of uncertainty. This is what the novel offers you. It tells you maybe, but maybe not, right? So I think, again, to me, it's like a different set of values that you are able to imbibe through fiction. And if we're not reading novels for those values, then I think fiction's on the back foot. If we're just going to them to say, okay, let me see how a novel has dealt with this political problem, or let me see what I can learn from this novel, or maybe I want to learn about this chapter in the history books, but I'll do it through a novel because it'll be more fun. To me, that's not essentially the role of fiction. It could be used in those instrumental ways, but that's not the heart of a novel. And so I'm also now doubting whether it's even a very hospitable time to be a writer of fiction. It's not, I think, strangely.
Well, people are making up their own fiction. I'm not going to go to Veer Savarkar, Escape from the Andaman's jails on the wings of a dove.
But now you're using fiction in the sense of untruth.
Yes, I am.
I am using fiction in the sense of a novel with a history.
Yeah, I do understand that. I do understand that is the case. And when you construct it, the topic of today is myth versus history. So between history and myth, you exist.
But also, to just similar but maybe slightly broader terms, imagination and reality.
Imagination and reality, I think. Yeah. Oh, she wants.
Sorry,
I think the camera is
because if we use the word myth too much, it just takes us in certain routes of thinking. but imagination reality may give us a slightly more wider playground.
Yeah, absolutely.
Completely.
And imagination to me is a species of knowledge.
So,
Unless you make space for imagination as something that you can learn from, a way of living in the world, which is, to me, as important as science and politics and history. And that way of living in the world is only possible to gain through the arts broadly, of course, not only through the novel, but because I'm a novelist, that's the turf that I would want to defend. Unless we make space for that, the novel or fiction writing will always be seen as instrumental to something. And to me, it isn't.
right. So, it's a comfortable place to be. Like, for example, if we leave history as something that is dry on the basis of verifiable fact, all right? If we were to do that, for instance, and if you were to imagine history, for instance, moving into it, I have to bring you down to a level. Would you say, for instance, that there is no strong dividing line between fact and fiction, Nilanjan?
No, I mean, who would make such a statement? Of course, there is. I mean, fact is fact and fiction is fiction, but it's not that the twain shall never meet. I think all novels, all imaginative, works, even if they are magic realism of the level of Marquez or whatever, have some underpinnings of fact and reality. It's just the it's just the, what should I say, what point of the spectrum does it lie on, right? So you like Victory City that Rushdie's just written, he's just taken the fact that there was the great Vijayanagar Empire, right? And to that he has added an entirely new world of imagination, which makes it maybe even more real than the historical kingdom that existed, or Midnight's Children, for example. It is, I mean, he takes out cuttings from the newspapers of those times on that guy who was murdered and so on. So, but it's just how imaginatively that he embeds those facts into his narrative. It's how those characters respond to that reality. It's his imagination of how those characters respond to that reality is what makes it so rich, and makes it, I think, so much more of an impact on the reader than something that is just dry. I mean, Anjum is an expert at this, and I'm just like, what should I say? I'm a hacker. I don't have any academic background in literature or philosophy of any of those things. I started writing just because I loved reading, and I started writing because I was getting bored on the way to the airport, and that's where it started. So much of my attempts at writing come from a very raw type of love. It's not very informed by academic discourses in literature and things like that. So at a simplistic level, yes, there is fact and there is fiction, there is imagination and reality, but the twain all meet together in a spectrum of novels, right?
They do. Yeah. So the question I have, going back to you, is actually the question is to both of you. One aspect of all narration, whether it's fact or whether it's fiction, is that you contribute to being a chronicle of record of some sort or the other, right? Because at some point in time, a chronicle of record used to be the newspaper, whatever they put over there. Even today, like you talked about Rushdie, who looked at newspaper reports, who looked at history textbooks and got whatever he got out of there. Those are all chronicles of record. Increasingly, as historical fiction develops in India, I would count you as among the pioneers of what will blossom into a huge, big industry of historical fiction, so to speak, where you take aspects of history and you write your novels based around these things. It's early days. I'm talking about the next 100 years of the same thing going on, as the case is. So how far do you see yourself as a contributor to this chronicle of record if you were to turn the clock 100 years forward and somebody looked at your novel for reference? What did you expect that they're going to get out of it?
I don't know if I'm writing historical fiction, though. Historical fiction is a very specific genre where you take a historical period or a historical event and fictionalize it, put words in the mouth of people, of people who may or may not have existed, but those historical events did take place, right? That is historical fiction, and it's a well-defined genre.
The question, you don't have to answer my question strictly in the definition of historical fiction per se, but a lot of the fiction that is set in places, for instance, even with people like Arthur Conan Doyle, for instance, a lot of what he wrote has been used by later historians when they write the book to talk about something that he set in a certain place and this waterfall and so on. And these were aspects that have built their way back into history just because the novelist was careful about describing something in a factual sense.
The novelist who fulfills that criteria that you're talking about is Leo Tolstoy.
Yeah. Oh, totally.
Or Chekhov as well, but Tolstoy in particular, you read his novels as histories of Russia in that period because he is capturing details no historian would think of everyday life, of the way people dressed and spoke and thought and prayed and ate. So you're right. In that sense, yes, a novel can be a history, and those 19th century novels were written as histories.
History's Angel, for instance, a lot of the book over there. And before the session, I just thought to myself, I said, what if I had read this book 100 odd years from today? What goes to my mind is things that whatever I draw from it, the mindset of people.
Yeah, absolutely.
How
in that sense, all novels are aiming to be historical records. In that sense, absolutely. That you are trying to get as close to the moment as possible. And again, fiction offers you ways to talk about things that other forms don't. The things that I just said, right? Everyday life, streetscapes, even idiom, the way people talk, right? The things that occupy them that may not be occupying people at all 100 years from now. So a novel is a historical record in that way, yes.
Right.
But I think to answer your question in a very Indian context, I think the challenge would be not so much about fact versus fiction. To me, that's not the challenge. It is about something that we all know to be true, but we struggle to bring into our writing, which is different ideas of what is real and what is imagined. The sort of dichotomy that Nilanjan brought up. A couple of months ago, I was here at BIC in this same hall talking about you are Ananthamurthy.
Right.
Okay, and he's, again, somebody who is a touchstone for me because he's really asked this question. What does it mean to be a modern Indian novelist writing about a certain, thinking characters when there is still a sort of universe of people around us who don't belong to that middle-class thinking, intellectualized society? What role, where are they in this form called the novel? And he has an essay. We were talking about his selected essays. It was reissued. It was issued as a new compendium, and so there was this panel of people talking about Ananthamurthy's work. And I recalled this one essay where a famous Indian artist is traveling somewhere in the hinterland, and he finds a stone that is decorated with a flower and some markings. Obviously, the stone has been made holy, right? The way we just have to walk out in the street in Bangalore and we know how people ritualize things in a very everyday and a completely natural way. So this man sees the stone and he can't help taking a photograph of it. And then he sees the sadhu who has done that and he says, I've taken a photo and I think I've interfered with your relationship to this stone. And the sadhu said, it doesn't matter, I'll just find another stone. Right? So, I mean, to me, this is imagination and reality in a very Indian sense. And to me, the challenge as a novelist, because I'm from the middle class and I have gone to the 19th century school where, the schools that you're talking about where history is taught in a particular way, those themselves are 19th century products, right? So why would they even be bothering with Mohenjo-daro before that, when that kind of school didn't exist before that? So we are all products of that, but there still is a substratum, or whatever you want to call it, that lives and thinks and breathes and imagines in another way. And to me, it has always been there, but I think increasingly I'm feeling the challenge or the anxiety of finding a language to bring that other that other way of living in imagination and reality into the space of a modern novel?
Democratizing all of that is the basis of what you're talking about in terms of being able to bring that narrative down. But Nilanjan, I have to ask you a question. Are you familiar with Professor Ganesh Devi's work?
No, I'm not.
He has written apart from that entire lot of volumes about language, recently he launched a book called Indians, which talked about, it's a very large story that he talks about the origins of the Indians and how they came down and development and so on, broken it up into several periods. He and I had a very interesting chat with him about social media. I was talking about how social media is the new language, it influences things. And again, you go back in time and look back. His very interesting take was that emojis are the new hieroglyphics. Whatever the ancients did in wall, cave paintings and so on, emojis are the new hieroglyphics. So if anything is set on record over here, and you go back in time and you look back, you will find little smileys and so on, whatever it is that you have. And that actually tells the story of the civilization that we are today, right? So in many ways, these are histories that are being constructed. You just talked about being a chronicle of record in terms of a novelist. If you draw from there and move forward from what Anjum just said, what do you think of social media? Is it a chronicle of record? A lot of people receive their history by it.
I think it's a drug that's killing us all. It's making us all stupid. What it gives in return is very little. With great reluctance, I am on social media because I have to sell my books and I have to sell my theater tickets.
Sure.
Otherwise, I would have thrown those damn things out of the window long ago.
Mm-hmm.
But is social media a chronicle of records? Yes. I mean, a future historian will have, every microsecond of every person who's got a smartphone, and then there must be 8 billion of them across every culture. It's an infinite stream of knowledge, and then you're going to say that no human being can analyze this data. So let's get an AI to analyze this data, and that AI, it depends on what sort of training that AI has, and it creates something which is consumable by human beings. Say, okay, 2022, looking at Brazil and Sao Paulo, this seems to be the 3 top trends that were happening there. Some such thing will come out, But it's the old principle of garbage in and garbage out. I'm really not sure what's going to be the value. There's a lot of quantity, of course. There's a lot of quantity in terms of, there is also, in a way, certain authenticity beyond emojis, which is just visuals and pictures, right? You're capturing pictures of, moment by moment picture of what's happening. And you can almost maybe create a film reel, but I'm not really sure. That's for future historians and who will probably become some AI specialists to decide on, how this material is going to be useful.
Yeah.
I don't know, really.
Before we wrap it up,
It's like newspapers and poetry. I mean, I don't know what has more, the daily news versus a poem or a film that just captures, the moment.
That's very evocative. Before we throw it open to questions, I want to come the full circle and ask the question that I asked in the beginning. What's the distance between myth and history? In the light of the above. All right?
I should say that in the mic so it's recorded in history, chronicle of record. You are incorrigible, Ramji. No, I wanted to respond to Nilanjan and say I'm thinking of calling my next book The Age of Trash. I think that'll be... I mean, instinctively I think, wow, and then I think of that title like displayed in a bookshop, and how many people will be like, I recognize myself in
You
that.
call it trash talk, it'll sell.
You think so? Yes. Okay, I might. Seriously, The Age of Trash. Watch out for The Age of Trash. But what's the difference between myth and history?
I'm not the one who picked the subject today.
But we don't...
No, I do understand it. But here's the deal. I'm actually working on a project, have been for the last almost 1 year now I'm writing the history of Bangalore, and we're going to come up with the various things over their podcasts and stuff like that.
Okay.
And my big challenge has been to separate myth and history. so much that we are proud of as Bangaloreans, that, oh, these are our facts and we did this, we did that, I suddenly find that either it's completely untrue, or there is no historical record for it, or it's all of the stuff that I said, exaggeration and so on and so forth. So we have talked about, mainly we've approached that subject from the standpoint of a novel, but for me, the big problem that I have had as a feature writer, magazine feature writer for all these years, has been to sit and say, okay, if I'm ever going to perpetrate my history of Bangalore on people, what is it going to look like? And where do I suddenly say this is fact? Where am I going to color between the lines? Where am I going to say, okay, I'm going to put this down there, you interpret it the way you want to interpret it? These are all, everything that I'm going to have to do in this very, very short amount of time. So you have the last word, Nilanjan.
Can I answer your question though?
Please, please do.
No. Only to say that I do think that we need to develop better skills to sift facts from non-facts. I won't even use the term.
Right.
We are not a scientifically minded society still. We still are given too easily to things that seem like facts, but we don't question them. So certainly I think there's so much more work to be done there.
And Nilanjan actually summed it up, that the answer to that question summed it up very well by talking about AI. And then the big question, how much do you trust AI? How has it been engineered? How has it been rejigged and rejigged? And there's now talking about, I will jig my AI this way and you will jig your AI that way. Let's leave this and send a rocket to Mars instead. So this is what's going on. Just suffice, it's fine if we end this discussion on, I have no idea what the distance is between myth and history. I'd like to do that. I'd like to move on. First of all, a round of applause to all. If I'll shepherd this. So questions, please. Anyone? Gentleman there.
That doesn't mean you're sheep.
Thank you for this. I kind of ran from my last lecture, so attention and participation here has been very voluntary. So thanks for that.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I said I ran from my last lecture of my class, and my attention here has been really voluntary, unlike my class. So
Thank
this
you.
has been very refreshing. Wanted to understand what your views are on the speculative nature of fiction.
Speculative what?
Nature of fiction, and specifically science fiction. So we see Frank Herbert's Dune, Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea trilogy, in kind of reimagining a new society that we can form. And I mean, the current paradigm we're living in the Anthropocene, kind of demands that as well. So what do you think the role of fiction is that?
Nilanjan, you want to take that one?
Can you repeat the last phrase about the Anthropocene?
Given that we're living in the Anthropocene and we're kind of,
Okay.
on the verge of extinction, as they say.
Yes.
What do you think is the role of fiction in kind of reimagining our relationship to nature?
Right. So I'm a big science fiction fan. I used to be, but sort of it's fallen off in recent years. So all the great science fiction writers of the past I've read, and in a way, this particular book, although it doesn't go into the deep future, is essentially I'm just being specific to this rather than commentating on the speculative fiction, science fiction genre as a whole, because my recent interaction with that has been low. But this particular book, for example, and maybe Anjum's as well, since it comes up to 2019, are essentially, in a way, at least for me, offers a peek into the sort of near future, the next 20, 30 years. It's not the age of, Star Wars and where you're inhabiting other planets, or you're evacuating all the equatorial areas because it's been flooded by the glaciers, and you've actually gone with Elon Musk's SpaceX. So it's not none of all that, but I think it's what Anjum also mentioned. It just tries to look forward a little ahead to see after 75 years, and specifically again to India, after 75 years, we are a richer, hotter, maybe angrier, but maybe more peaceful nation in certain ways. We're better off in many ways, we're worse off in many ways. And how is this likely to pan out? And there are certain hints given at the at the ending of the book, which are quite obvious in the way that the narrator or the characters have been through, in the way that this will pan out. So it is not science fiction in any sense. That sort of writing, like I said, what the future holds for humanity, I think people like Yuval Harari and all have probably done a decent job, although he's frauded his way through in some things, in essentially extrapolating trends that he sees today and he sees exploding in the future. But crystal gazing, I think, is a difficult thing and is a very dangerous thing. It's even more difficult and dangerous when you're doing it in non-fiction. So I think speculative fiction is a good way to try and do some sort of crystal gazing. If you're wrong, it doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't create policymakers to take decisions based on those type of things, which people take seriously. So speculative fiction, in a way, is I think also very comforting, or not so comforting, depending on what you're writing about, for the present people, the people who are living. We are living today. And I think speculative fiction should give us either hope or make us despair if it's done, or make us think about the future that we are headed towards. So, and I think speculative fiction can do a good job of that, because it always places the human being at the center of circumstances. The circumstances might change. It might be AI, and in 3 years' time we might find that AI was a big fraud perpetrated on us. That's also possible. And then Yuval Harari may end up looking very silly. But if you've developed your characters well and you've done it well, yeah, it could well be like Asimov. He wrote about the pervasiveness of robots and robotic societies. He says it was coming. He said by 1999, 2000, we will have robots doing everything. It hasn't happened. However, I still love reading the robot novels by Asimov, because they're done so well, and because they place the human being at the center of all the stories, and therefore he's still relevant. So that's my, anyway, sort of.
May I ask a question of that gentleman?
No,
Nilanjan?
shall we take the more questions before? Okay.
We just, very, very quickly, I just wanted to ask a question just to wrap this up. You had mentioned Anthropocene. What is the significance of the period in your question?
Man changing the earth.
Is that what it was?
Given that we're kind of we're living in the industrial complex. And
Okay, so the industrial got it.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, man is the dominant force over nature now.
I
So
understand.
I think, roughly.
This gentleman here.
I have a very fundamental question, right? I'll ask the question and I'll give 2 examples for context. I want to ask, what is the system of record, right? Proof of record. A good example is the current age, right? Somebody tweets something, and then it comes on, say, CNN 18 News or whatever, or it comes on NDTV, that is turned into an article about, whatever, like maybe Salman Khan or somebody else, Elon Musk did. And then the next day, it comes in the newspaper, right? So it has become, in some sense, a system of record. That is one aspect. The other aspect is maybe somebody in Pompeii, or maybe if the Battle of Kurukshetra happened, has written down something, and his obviously maybe the armies were very small, and maybe it was a skirmish, but surreptitiously added a couple of zeros. But that is also in some sense a record. So how do we even say, like, what is the, again, like, to ask you a question, right? Because what is myth and what is history? Because somebody is a narrator, and we don't know if that narrator is, again, reliable. And that is where I think the East versus West comes, right? The West actually has a lot of written history, but a lot of Indian what we call, I like the word, but Oriental history is very, what is the word? Oral. Or if you see in China or like Far East Asia, it's more visual. So how do we kind of reconcile, the system of record, obviously, because that could be fiction too. And what we write, we know now it is, maybe at least some of it is fiction, but how do we reconcile the two and, draw on that boundary? Because the way I see it personally, I think it's a very porous boundary. You can't separate out the two, because you see something and somebody's interpreting is something. So, and it's the same thing, like, what Nilanjan was saying, AI is also reinterpreting something, and depends on how humans were trained and how AIs were trained. So,
Again, as a novelist, what fascinates me is the person asking the question, not the question itself. Like, what is, what is it about our age that produces this anxiety about what is the historical record and how do we know what is true? Because it's also the age when we have the best possible ways of knowing, right? If there was ever a time when we had access to tools and knowledge and the means of building on the historical record, obviously it's today. We were never as well informed as we are today, and yet never never have we been as anxious. And to me, that anxiety is fascinating. Having said that, I think the oral as a source is not necessarily, I think many historians would say it's not necessarily inferior, it's just an interesting alternative to the written record or the verifiable, within quotes, record. So oral history is increasingly seen as, you know, a valid source in itself for the writing of history. And in fact, now people are saying that we need to have more, you know, oral narration as alternative history and not this grand textbook vision of India as, you know, proceeding through the centuries and the doings of great men, and mostly great men and some great women. So oral is not, to me, it's again enabling rather than the basis for doubt about how do we know what is true. So yeah, for me, what is more exciting is to ask ourselves, why are we anxious about what is true and what is not true? Where is that anxiety coming from?
To answer your question mechanically, the mechanical side of it is that the discipline of journalism, for instance, which has gone haywire recently, you talked about East versus West. Even today in American newspapers, and I'm very familiar with what they do, I'm using them as an example. It's true of a lot of places. There's an entire department given to fact-checking. Nothing can go into the paper until it's passed by fact-checking. And that simply means that if a journalist put down something on a report that they filed saying that so-and-so said something, somebody there will pick up the phone, call that person and say, please confirm you said this. And it's only after it goes through it. These things happen very quickly. They happen in an hour or half an hour, 10 minutes sometimes. And the entire country, the entire culture, that society, is given to admitting that they said something or didn't say something. It's very, very seldom, I have found in my experience, that somebody says, no, I didn't say it, no, I take it back. None of that happens mostly. Mostly they say it, they're available, they get a text saying that I'm calling from the New York Times, can you please confirm it? They say yes. And so there are a lot of checks and balances that go into it. Now, yesterday, it's funny, you've heard of Nupur Basu, the former NDTV journalist, for instance. She and I were texting, and there was this controversy about Modi was seen in a plane without a hood, you know, the top of the plane at 25,000 feet at almost Mach 1 speeds or something, and somebody said, the truth of the matter is that it's false. There's no question. Nobody flies a plane in that respect. He was in the plane, and they did have a hood on top of it, etc. But it found its way so deeply, as you said. Before you know what's happening, it's news, and how do you verify it and how do you bring it back? The question is, it's the very fact that we are sitting and talking about it even as a possibility is either we are in our minds, we have gone back to being schoolyard children, yeah. You know, I hate you 1,100,000 crore times, that sort of stuff, or editorial oversight has become absent, and I think that's what it is.
That is definitely there in India.
Yes, and please.
I agree with you on the Western media. The only thing counter to that I would say is the Iraq war and the weapons of mass destruction. While the individual sources can be verified, mythologies can also be formed. And I think Noam Chomsky has also...
I think Chomsky had the whole manufacturing consent, that entire thing. Well. That is to be true. Yeah. And sometimes expediency takes the better of the truth. And, you know, that's something that the world has to live with. But again, I think that in life there's no black and white. They say that everything's shades of grey. The question is how much shades of grey.
Yeah, so that's why I use the word porosity.
It's very porous. Yeah. It's not. No, I don't know what is now porosity. I think is now flipped. The osmosis is the truth coming into it somewhere. That's why. Anyone? You? Yeah. Yes, sir.
So just carrying on from what you mentioned, right? So someone had asked me about fiction versus non-fiction in terms of genres of reading. And based on what I'm hearing from all of this, I sort of also want to echo my thoughts into it and say the difference there is why I prefer fiction as opposed to non-fiction is that good fiction actually has a lot of truth in it, which is visible, and non-fiction has a lot of imagination in it, which is not visible. Right. So, I was going back to the autobiographies that I had on my bookshelf, and I happened to glance at Lance Armstrong's autobiography. It's not about the bike. The incontrovertible history of Tour de France, as written in 2015, would have been very different from the incontrovertible history of Tour de France written in 2022. Right?
That's a good one.
So I think the importance that good fiction writers like you guys have in that sense is more, because I think there's a lot of truth that you can bring out and which can become a record of history for the future, as opposed to non-fiction itself, where you don't know what is true.
I think this is the first time in the whole 1.5 hours that we've used the word truth in a sense that does not have to do with facts and non-facts. So thank you. Thank you. That's wonderful.
We have
Thank you.
one more question.
Shreyas
Gentlemen.
has a question. Yeah.
I think we'll do one question. Gentleman there also raises his hand.
Thank you for the conversation. I had a kind of a simple question, which is that for me, myth and history, if you develop a capacity in reading myth and history, you develop a capacity in interpretation. And most importantly, interpreting the present in an imaginative way, interpreting reality in an imaginative way. And I feel like today, that's what we lack is the practice of interpretation. We've become poor interpreters. So my question is, how does the act of writing and reading contribute to sort of an interpretive capacity?
It's a nice question.
Well, I just came across a quote from Walter Benjamin. In fact, the title of my novel, as you know, is taken from an essay by Walter Benjamin. But that's to do with the way we look at history, the possibilities, the challenges. This other quote had to do with novel writing. And he says, the whole history of the novel, and of course he means a particular history of the novel, is a man sitting alone in a room thinking. Right? So I think the possibility for developing that interpretative skill is tied somehow to the possibility for solitude, for independence, for valuing our own, how should I put it, just the boundaries of our own selves as like, I am somebody who feels this way because that's who I am. I think that's, to me, the ultimate freedom that allows for both the novel, in the Walter Benjamin sense, the man alone in the room thinking, and if you look at the history, again, when I say history, I'm talking about the European novel, it is about characters who want to be able to do that. Henry James heroines are all about, Henry James novels are all about people who are fighting to be their own selves, within a very regulated social system to make some space for themselves. That is that pushing of the individual against the social structure is the history of the novel. So I think if we are able to give value to that, interpretative skills are, of course, also very technical things that you learn, that you acquire. But I think if we can make space somehow through the reading of fiction or through other means, through the arts in general, for just allowing individual imagination to not always have this anxiety of where do I stand on this debate, on which side of the divide am I? That anxiety, if the imagination somehow can allow us to be free of that for a moment, I think we will be better interpreters or less anxious interpreters.
Thank you very much for a very fascinating discussion. I have a couple of comments and one question. You mentioned that towards the end of your discussion, you mentioned we are not a very scientific society and we don't look at history also in a very systematic fashion. But is there any society that you would consider as scientific looking at their history? I would say, I happen to live in Florida, and I went through this whole pandemic in the United States, and I felt that I was schizophrenic or everybody else was schizophrenic. The same so-called science of even of vaccine is being questioned. So I don't know whether that is going to help us much looking very scientifically, because everybody looks at it still in a different way. And even the scientists were, and Anthony Fauci, considered one of the most scientific people from the NIH, was considered almost like he had death threats and stuff like that, because people were convinced that he was lying. So that is one point I wanted to make. Also, I think in a sense of an ending, the novel, there is a definition of history is at the point of intersection of imperfect memory and incomplete documentation is one of the definitions he uses. And so, again, we are not going to be able to tell, and I think myth is something that we know we take as fiction and may have some facts in it, while history is, a lot of history is waiting to be proven to be false and mythical, probably. So there's such an overlap. I don't think we can come up with a definite, clear difference. Somebody asked about difference between fact and fiction, and it's going to be like that. So I'm just reminded of the character in, I don't know, you guys are all too young to have seen a movie, Western, called The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, and that the Jimmy Stewart, who gets all the credit for killing the villain, is really not the one who shot him. It's John Wayne. But when he tries to clarify that to the reporter says, "This is the West, sir. When the legend becomes fact, we print the legend." So that's about. So that's where we are. I just wanted to make that comment.
Well said. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Did you mean the Julian Barnes novel?
No, it's a movie called The Man Who Shot.
No, it's the sense of an ending.
Sense of an ending.
The Julian Barnes novel you meant?
Yes.
Do we have time for one more? We're out of time.
I think we can do one.
Yeah, that'll be great. So it's a very, just couple of thoughts. I think the man who sits in a room actually also lives. And the charm of the novel is you get to enter that world in which he or she has actually been part of. And we get that experience of the world. And history, I just wanted to, there's something that I think we think of it as facts, but actually it's psychology, it's sociology, it's lived. It can be seen through the lives that have been lived in that time. So I think in that way, every novel offers that as well. And a good novel offers that as well. So I just wanted to, thank you.
Well, there are two good novels that you can get your hands on outside, as I understand. You've read both of them? Well, for the others in that case. But let me jump ahead of the queue and ask you both to sign my copy. Right? So, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.